Pertama-tama mari kita panjatkan puji dan syukur kehadirat Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala karena atas berkah dan rahmat-Nya pada pagi hari ini, Kamis 17 Maret 2022, kita dapat berkumpul secara daring dalam keadaan sehat dalam acara Diseminasi Hasil Analisis Badan Pengkajian dan Pengembangan Perdagangan tahun 2021 dengan tema Mempertahankan Tren Positif Kinerja Perdagangan Indonesia melalui Transformasi Perdagangan. Bapak dan Ibu yang kami hormati, acara pembukaan akan segera kita mulai. Dan untuk itu, acara pertama kita adalah menyanyikan lagu kebangsaan Indonesia Raya. Untuk itu, kami mohon kesediaan Bapak dan Ibu untuk dapat menyalakan kamera dan memberikan sikap sempurna dari tempat masing-masing. Untuk itu, kepada panitia, kami persilahkan. Terima kasih. Bapak dan Ibu, acara selanjutnya adalah pembacaan doa yang akan dipimpin oleh Bapak Muhsin. Tentunya kita semua berharap agar acara kita pada pagi hari ini dapat berlangsung dengan lancar dan baik. Untuk itu kepada Bapak Muhsin kami persilahkan.
Baik, bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Konfirmasi, suara saya sudah terdengar?
Terdengar, Pak.
Baik. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Mohon izin untuk membacakan doa sesuai tuntunan agama Islam. A'udzubillahi minasyaitonirrajim. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahirabbil alamin. Assalatu wassalamu ala asrofil anbiya'i wal mursalin wa ala alihi washabbihi ajma'in. Allahumma ya Allah, dengan mengucap puji dan syukur kehadirat-Mu atas segala rahmat dan karunia yang telah dilimpahkan kepada kami, sehingga kami dapat hadir bersama dalam acara Diseminasi Hasil Analisis Badan Pengkajian dan Pengembangan Perdagangan. Allahumma ya Allah, jadikanlah kegiatan ini sebagai majelis ilmu yang membuahkan ilmu yang bermanfaat bagi masyarakat dan negara kami. Ya Allah, ya Rabbana, kegiatan ini ditujukan hanya untuk memperoleh ridho-Mu. Untuk itu, berilah petunjuk dan bimbingan kepada kami agar kami dapat menjalankannya dengan baik. Allahumma ya Allah, jadikan kami semua sebagai orang yang memiliki sifat amanah. Jadikan pemimpin yang amanah, pelaksana yang amanah, karena kami yakin dengan sifat amanah akan mendatangkan ridho dan keberkahan-Mu. Ya Allah, limpahkanlah pengetahuan, rasa persaudaraan, dan keikhlasan kepada kami, sehingga tercipta persatuan yang kokoh di antara kami. Ya Allah, ya Rahman, ya Rahim, ampunilah dosa dan kesalahan kami, dosa kesalahan kedua orang tua kami, dan dosa orang-orang yang telah mendahului kami. Allahumma arinal haqqa haqqa warzuqna ittiba'ah, wa arinal batil batilan warzuqna ijtinabah. Allahumma tahlana abwabal khairi wa abwabal barakah wa abwabal ni'mati wa abwabal rizqi wa abwabal quwati wa abwabal sihati wa abwabal salamati wa abwabal jannah. Rabbana atina fid dunya hasanah wa fil akhirati hasanah wa qina adzaban nar. Walhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Terima kasih banyak Bapak Muhsin. Baik Bapak dan Ibu serta seluruh peserta dimanapun berada, acara selanjutnya adalah sambutan dari Kepala Badan Pengkajian dan Pengembangan Perdagangan sekaligus pembukaan acara kita pada pagi hari ini. Untuk itu dengan hormat kepada Bapak Kasan kami persilahkan.
Ya, terima kasih Din. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat pagi, salam sejahtera buat kita semua. Yang saya hormati Bapak Pieter Van de Mheen, Direktur PwC Consulting Indonesia. Yang saya hormati Bapak Ibu pimpinan di Kementerian Perdagangan, 1, 2, dan juga seluruh yang hadir. Pada pagi hari ini kita melaksanakan kegiatan diseminasi hasil analisis dari Badan Pengkajian dan Pengembangan Perdagangan untuk hasil-hasil yang dilaksanakan pada kegiatan tahun 2021 yang lalu. Bapak Ibu, pertama-tama tentu marilah kita panjatkan puji dan syukur kehadirat Allah Subhanahu wa taala karena pada pagi hari ini kita dapat hadir dan mengikuti kegiatan diseminasi ini. Diseminasi tentu ini adalah bagian dari tugas dan juga fungsi kami di BP3, yaitu sebagai salah satu bentuk transparansi dan komunikasi publik bagi hasil-hasil kegiatan. Bapak Ibu yang saya hormati, Badan Pusat Statistik baru saja merilis mengenai pertama pertumbuhan ekonomi di tahun lalu yang telah kembali positif setelah tahun 2020 yang lalu mengalami kontraksi sebesar 2,07%. Dan tentu kami juga mencatat salah satu kontribusi yang signifikan terhadap capaian pertumbuhan ekonomi tahun 2021 maupun 2020 adalah pertumbuhan ekspor dan impor. Dan ini satu catatan yang tentu saja cukup menggembirakan, tetapi di tahun ini tentu kita masih menghadapi beberapa tantangan yang setelah pandemi kita lewati secara baik, dan juga sekarang setelah gelombang Omikron kita sudah membaik, namun tantangan baru dari invasi atau konflik Rusia dengan Ukraina itu juga menjadi tantangan yang akan berdampak juga kepada kinerja perdagangan, khususnya tentunya ekspor dan impor. Catatan lain dari pertumbuhan ekonomi yang positif di tahun 2021 yang tumbuh 3,7%, saya kira ini juga menjadi satu hal yang kemudian kita mengambil tema dalam acara diseminasi hari ini, yaitu mempertahankan tren positif kinerja perdagangan Indonesia melalui transformasi perdagangan. Kenapa kita menyebutnya sebagai transformasi? Tentu ada beberapa yang kami pahami, yang kami maknai dengan namanya transformasi. Transformasi kami pertama adalah kaitan dengan struktur ekspor misalnya. Tentu kita ingin struktur ekspor akan terus diberikan kontribusinya lebih besar kepada produk-produk yang berupa manufaktur. Karena catatan kita juga di tahun 2021 yang lalu, gap antara kontribusi dari produk manufaktur dengan komoditas atau komoditi primer itu semakin sempit. Bahkan mudah-mudahan itu akan menjadi struktur sebagai awal memasuki shifting yang lebih besar kepada manufaktur. Lalu transformasi yang kita maknai juga, tentu ini adalah kaitan dengan yang kita sebut sebagai digitalisasi di sektor perdagangan. Digitalisasi internal, baik berupa pelayanan, fungsi dan tugas administrasi, dan sebagainya. Yang juga tak lupa adalah transformasi digitalisasi perdagangan di sektor-sektor yang selama ini juga menjadi bagian penting dari kontribusi sektor perdagangan di dalam negeri maupun ekspor. Kita mencatat bahwa kontribusi dari tumbuhnya digitalisasi melalui marketplace misalnya atau e-commerce itu tumbuh sangat signifikan selama periode pandemi. Dan kita juga mencatat bahwa ekonomi digital yang di dalamnya adalah termasuk e-commerce yang menjadi bagian penting kontributor utama di ekonomi digital, itu juga terus tumbuh dari tahun ke tahun. Bahkan tahun ini mungkin Bank Indonesia telah memprediksi atau mentargetkan lebih dari 500 triliun nilai transaksi melalui e-commerce. Nah, oleh karena itu Bapak Ibu sekalian, pada pagi hari ini tim dari BP3 akan menyampaikan paparan presentasi hasil analisis dari bidang perdagangan dalam negeri, bidang perdagangan luar negeri, serta bidang kerjasama perdagangan internasional. Untuk pengayaan kita semua dalam kesempatan ini, kami juga mengundang secara khusus Pak Pieter Van de Mheen. Terima kasih Pak Pieter yang sudah hadir. Beliau adalah the Direktur PwC Consulting Indonesia yang nanti akan menyampaikan judul makalah yaitu Digitalization is important to capture Indonesia trade growth potentials. Kami juga yakin bahwa ekspor dari Indonesia itu masih jauh dari potensialnya. Termasuk saya kira pemanfaatan digitalisasi untuk kegiatan ekspor ini. Beberapa pelaku bahkan juga ada asosiasi yaitu platform digital untuk ekspor, tapi juga saya kira platform-platform digital ini untuk kegiatan ekspor sudah juga berkembang ke beberapa sektor yang menjadi pendukung atau supporting dari kegiatan ekspor seperti logistik, digitalisasi pembayarannya, lalu digitalisasi invoice, dokumen, bahkan yang juga kami dengar belum lama ini ada juga untuk e-paper untuk digitalisasi seperti materai misalnya dalam transaksi untuk bukti invoice yang ditransaksikan oleh para pelaku usaha. Nah, oleh karena itu saya secara khusus mengucapkan terima kasih kepada Pak Pieter dan semoga nanti kita semua mendapatkan insight yang sangat bermanfaat untuk memahami bagaimana peran dari digitalisasi di perdagangan ini bisa mengangkat atau memotret potensi perdagangan Indonesia yang jauh lebih besar daripada yang sudah terjadi saat ini. Dan terakhir, tentu saya juga mengucapkan terima kasih dan apresiasi kepada pembicara tamu ini, Pak Pieter, dan juga seluruh presenter nanti tim dari BP3 yang sudah nanti akan menyampaikan paparannya. Harapan kami tentu diseminasi ini dapat memberikan pemahaman terhadap isu-isu atau topik-topik di sektor perdagangan ini dan juga tentunya menjadi salah satu bahan dalam pertimbangan kebijakan di bidang perdagangan bagi seluruh sektor yang terlibat. Demikian, terima kasih. Dan dengan ucapan Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, saya membuka secara resmi Diseminasi Hasil Analisis BP 3 pada hari ini, Kamis 17 Maret 2022. Sekian, wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Terima kasih banyak Pak Kepala atas sambutan dan pembukaannya. Dan acara selanjutnya adalah kita akan bersama-sama mendengarkan paparan dari Pricewater House Coopers Indonesia dengan judul yang telah disebutkan oleh Bapak Kepala, yaitu Digitalization is Important to Capture Indonesia's Trade Growth Potential. For that, to Mr. Pieter Van de Mheen, the screen is yours.
Okay, thank you. Selamat pagi. First check is, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you clearly.
Okay, good. All right, thanks. Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Pieter Van de Mheen. I'm a partner of PwC Indonesia, so I'm living in Indonesia since 2014, and unfortunately my language skills are not yet so developed I can do this in Bahasa Indonesia. My apologies, right? But first of all, let me thank you for inviting us to share our thoughts about digital trade, because it's an enormous important topic, right, for every country in the world, and even in more, if you go to a more granular level, for every company and every institution, and also for us as individuals. So a bit about my background and how I will look at this, right? So I come from a supply chain optimization background, right? Process improvement. So I've been working till, say, 2003, mostly on the physical optimization of trade, right? Physical optimization of trade in Europe, US, a bit in Asia. And you arrived at a point that you could only do so much on the physical type of it, right? Which is inventory, transport, delivery to clients. And then, of course, digitization kicked in, which opened a complete new area of improving trade. So what am I going to share you today? I will come up with a few slides. It's only 10 slides on. First topic is where are we today, right? And how is it looking? How's the growth looking for Indonesia? We will look at policies. What are successful policies to grow trade and digital trade? And I will summarize in a slide on where we think Indonesia could actually turn some buttons to improve trade. Now, just to manage expectations, I will not talk today about the technology behind it, right? So I will not talk about artificial intelligence, smart contracts, crypto trade, blockchain, etc., because I think that's something which could be and should be left to markets and some parts of the government, right? Like whatever. So I will just talk about the trade in general. So next slide, please. One remark on this slide: digital trade is a wide definition, right? So if you look at the statistics, you will find a lot of definitions. So it is a bit ambiguous on what's included and what's not. Just this snapshot of trade. Where are we? We had, of course, COVID, which I come back later, which is a sort of blessing in disguise for digital trade. But what you see is that the trade is obviously recovering. We looked at what is actually changing the pre-pandemic situation for Indonesia. It was a deficit in trade to a surplus in trade. Not surprisingly, this is commodity based. We've been looking for elements of trade, digital trade in there, but that was neglectable. for a understandable reason. But still, trade accounts for roughly 30% of GDP, so that's a big number. And what you obviously will see over the years, that the digital portion of it will grow. Now, next slide. So where are we today? So there's a lot of information in the slide, so let me go through it. First, on the definition of digital trade, obviously everything traded through e-commerce platforms, travel, but also ride-hail and digital payment, but also, of course, digital products being sold over the internet. So games, etc., digital services, analysis, etc. It's all part of it, right? Again, there's not a global definition which is standardized, but roughly that's the pocket. So where are we today? If you look at 2021, roughly 6% of GDP can be sort of clustered under digital trade e-commerce, which is quite a number. But if you look at the growth rate year to year, right, that's double digit, right? From 2019 to 2020, roughly 26% growth. If you compare 2020 to 21, it's roughly 50. Obviously, there is a big factor, growth factor, driven by the pandemic, as we all noticed. But nevertheless, the trend is it's growing, and it's growing fast, right? Which is, I think, knowledge we all have. Now, an interesting point, I mentioned COVID, interesting point there is COVID drove a lot of innovation and rethinking of processes in the industry, and also in governments, by the way, right? So some figures, we looked at some of the stats and the analysis we did in Indonesia, and our estimate is that 90% of the large firms took action in adopting digital solutions to respond to COVID, right? Which means, in general, better planning, better and easier interaction with consumers. But also more interesting is, I think, because that's also surprising, because they have, of course, that's the size and the money to do it, but small firms and micro firms also responded quite heavily. So this whole COVID boosted enormously the ability to do transactions digitally in terms of ordering, in terms of planning of production and delivery, and payment, of course, right? Now, some remark on the government. I think you've seen some really good initiatives between coordination between the ministries involved, MOF, Cominfo, Ministry of Trade, and the Ministry of Industry. So I think that's also, it didn't stop, actually accelerated during COVID. So I think that's a good, good sign. Now, how are we looking at it? Next slide, right. So is the expectation that Indonesia can keep this massive momentum growing? The answer is yes, for a couple of reasons, right? If you look at the bottom graph, you see that the internet penetration can still grow roughly 10%. Internet penetration is defined as the people having access to internet and using it, right? But also the other one, the darker orange, if you wish, the buyer penetration also still has roughly 20% room to growth, right? Which means the people we're using internet right now, 57% roughly is buying on the internet, right? So that means there's still room, and that's a prediction of 20% increase of people who actually shop, if you wish, right? Buy stuff on the internet to online. So that's a big trend, right? So what's the effect of it? Is that the gross merchandise value, that's the top graph, will grow roughly CAGR growth of 22%, which is substantial. Gross merchandise value is basically the value of everything traded on the through e-commerce web-enabled applications, and that includes the gross trading value, right? So it includes the cost of the goods of the services, plus the markups in terms of margins, logistics, etc. E-commerce, not a surprise, I think, will have the majority, the lion's share of it, which is, we estimate, roughly 75% of the total, and the other 25% is is divided on tech, health, travel, media, etc. What else do I need to say about this? Obviously, the government of Indonesia needs to continue their, if you wish, to build on the foundation, the facilitation of it. There has been big investments about already the digital connectivity, right? The dark fiber network through the archipelago. Need to work more on digital workforce, skills enhancement, etc. But I think these initiatives are good, but obviously should be continued. Now, let's talk a bit about the policies, right, which are actually supporting the development of trade. So maybe we can go to the next slide. So what we will look at under this heading, we will look at some of the lessons we could learn from other economies and countries in the world. So I'll start with the general hypothesis, right, which is about that partnerships between countries, and also you can project that to the domestic trade, are really crucial to facilitate trade growth, right? I put the word digital in it because we talk about digital, but in fact, what happens is if you stimulate and make normal trade easier, automatically it will generate a growth in digital trade, because it's very hard to really distinguish them in black and white, right? There's a big gray area. So I think, let me share an example on what this could mean. I worked, as I said, around till 2003 on physical optimization of trade in Europe. And in those years, the European Union really made all the rules homogeneous, right? They were all the same, and they simplified them. So they got rid of import duties. They harmonized VAT. They harmonized customer protection rules. They harmonized data ownership rules, right? Which, by the way, they're still doing. So, but what that meant was that instead of, if you would sell a product, instead of you need to have 22 different warehouses and 22 different sales organizations in every country, we suddenly could go to a situation where you only needed 3 warehouses, right, in whole Europe, and you could deliver to clients within 24 hours by road, right? Not by air, not by whatever courier service, regular services within 24 hours. So you would bring back trade costs and the cost of products with easily 15 to 20%, which boomed the domestic trade in the European Union. So if you would project this, and obviously the situation in South Asia is totally different, right? So you cannot copy this. But my point is, if you would invest in agreements with your trade partners where you harmonize things like import duties, tax agreements, regulations, data ownership, right? For instance, we know that there's obviously data protection on some data you can store locally, only locally, domestically. Some data you can allow to store internationally. These things are very important to stimulate trade. Now, obviously, a large part of the Indonesian trade is domestic. But what you will see is that the connectivity to an international trade framework will boost trade in general, which particularly if you look at the manufacturing industry in Indonesia, could be very important, right? Now, we come back to this later. Now we go to what are the possible countries you want to look at in terms of what supporting policies do they have and did they apply to grow their digital economy. So maybe the next slide. So let me talk you through this slide. If you go from the left to the right, we have defined 4 success factors of digital trade, right? In random order, because they're not, it's not necessarily that bilateral relationships are the most important, but that's an important factor. Tax perspectives and regulations. How do you deal with tax, VAT, import duties, etc. Government stimulus and involvement, and workforce, right? Because at the end, a digital economy blooms by a couple of things. One of them is, do we have the talent to actually develop new services and develop new ideas, right? So we choose China and the US for a couple of reasons. One is sort of geographical size of it. Second, both have a huge domestic market, like Indonesia. And the other interesting thing is they have totally different perspectives on how they actually want to run the country, right? So the governments are different. US, democracy with all the good and the bad things. China, autocracy with all the good and the bad things, right? So, but both are number 1 and 2 in a digital economy market value in 2022, right? So they're powerhouses. They're both growing really fast, and they have a technology in a digital sector which are both top of the world and are heavily competing, even though I would argue China is more independent on technology developed in the US than the other way around. But they are almost equal, and they came from 2 different perspectives. So let me look at, and the idea is that we look at those. There might be some ideas which Indonesia could look at and could consider, right? And you can never copy this, but probably some ideas. So if you look at China, right? Next slide. If you look at China, you will see that they focused on four key elements to grow digital trade. And first one, start on the left upper corner, is the bilateral relationship which they develop. Obviously, that's part of China's foreign policies, etc. So it's not a standalone thing, but they deliberately developed 2 initiatives to trade. One is the One Belt, One Road initiative, which is actually a physical trade lane, if you wish, right? So they connect rail, they connect ports, they connect airports, with the idea to ease logistics, right? Supporting to that is also regulatory alignment on import, etc. But the other thing is they also have a specifically initiative around Digital Silk Road initiative, which is to stimulate their digital powerhouses to connect internationally, right? So they are focused on it. Then the next 2 things are around foreign investment and digital knowledge sharing. They have a very active policy, and they always had it, but specifically now we talk about digital, about managing from a central perspective, what companies do we need to invest in to acquire knowledge for the domestic market so we can grow our own industry. So they do it in two ways. One is a lot of money investing in companies overseas, right, to get those companies in. The other one is to attract companies to work in China to capture the local market, but then the trade is, okay, you can only earn so much of your shares and you have to transfer knowledge. The second essential part of this is people, right? Even though China is really protected a lot of regulations, it's relatively easy to work and study in China, and specifically when there is a certain job and knowledge framework attached to it, right? So they deliberately attract talent into China, but also they deliberately send people to study at the top universities in the world and work locally in the US, in Europe, in tech companies, right? So they really are actually not in general they're open, but on specific areas they are really focused on, okay, I want to have this knowledge, I want to develop this industry in China, how do I get it? We invest and we build knowledge, right? Come back to that later. Now, since it's an autocratic in society, they have obviously very strong industry policies and power to develop certain areas. That's very hard to copy, but obviously it's part of their success. And if you see the growth rate on the right-hand side, it's a CAGR of 17.1%, which is of course still double digit, right? Which is, I think, an interesting development. Maybe next slide. Now let's go to the US. The US obviously much longer involved in digital development and a totally different market. There the government has only a supporting and facilitating role. They leave everything up to the market, so very open, and they allow their talent, right, both in entrepreneurial talent and knowledge talent, to develop the business and make sure that they have prospering companies, right? So even though they are open, they have a very strong regulatory framework, right? Not a lot, but what they have is really strong. Antitrust, robust protection of ownership and patents, etc. They have very transparent but also regulated financial market. So there is a free flow of capital and knowledge, but it's all protected quite well, right? So at the bottom, all the logos of the big companies, and in total, 50% of the total US stock market value, right, capitalization, is represented by those 6 companies, which is amazing, right? These are real powerhouses. So if you would compare that to the Chinese powerhouses, right, they are now being regulated, but they're roughly the same sort of size. They're even bigger, and they definitely have more international reach. Second point, which actually is related to the regulation, they are imposing net neutrality, right? And if I talk about net neutrality, is obviously the internet, but it's also access to data storage, data sharing, etc. And that's very strongly regulated. So everybody has the same starting point, if you wish, right? And as a consequence of open market and net neutrality, they have an enormous amount of startups being registered in the US. And obviously, as the stats showed directly because of underneath, because of that, obviously there is a lot of tech unicorns, right, which are established and headquartered in the US, which about 48%, 50% global unicorns are still in the US, which is, I think, an impressive stat, right? Now, we come to the third point where they are really good in the United States, which is about workforce, right? How do you build talent? How do you grow them, and how do you retain them in the US, right? To work with the big companies in the big markets. And they are pretty open, right? In the US, if you have the right background and if you have the right study background, it's not so difficult to get into the US and get a job. So they actually stimulate it as well, right? And compared to China, where China had to build knowledge, in the US, you can argue, well, they have this very strong foundation, but even there they realize that you need to be open to the best minds in the world to grow your own capability. So at the bottom, I think an interesting stat is that the jobs in the science, technology, and engineering and maths area, which is the STEM jobs, if you want, grows twice as fast, rough now, it's not completely, but 70% faster than the normal jobs, right? Which means there is a massive ask for it. And that has not come down in COVID time, right? It increased. So everywhere in the world, they are looking for this talent. So the question for Indonesia is, of course, how do I actually attract those people? And if I have local talent, how do I prevent them from leaving the country and going somewhere else? Next slide. So what can we learn from it, right? So obviously on a high level, and pretty logical, keep improving the ease of doing business in Indonesia. Indonesia is not known for the ease of doing business, right? It's pretty not only bureaucratic, it's complex, and that hampers companies coming in Indonesia. Now, that is sometimes connected to protecting domestic industries, which is all understandable, but over time, this is very important to grow trade in general, of course, that's nothing new, but also digital trade. The second point is collaboration, networks with other countries, but also make sure that you harmonize trade regulations and facilitations across the country and across industries. Because what you see is that these digital powerhouses, they move from one service to the other, and they move to different industries, right? From ride hailing into finance, into retailing, into production, etc. So it helps if you make it homogeneous across industries as well. Third point, I think very important. How do you shape a digital talent workforce, right? How do you actually actively educate, stimulate, transform the workforce to be more oriented to develop and work in digital services? There are some initiatives going on, which I think is very good. But I think it requires a lot more attention, and obviously education is a spearheaded area for the current government, and this is, I think, part of it. Now, just to put on the sideline there, I've been asked for a few companies to look in Indonesia for possibilities to outsource digital services to companies in Indonesia. In that search, it popped up that there is a massive digital nomad economy booming in Bali, and I think that points to one of the possible attractive areas or attractive features of Indonesia is connected to the possibility and the opportunity to work in nice places outside big cities, etc., which is actually quite in demand because of COVID. Just one of the things that surprised me in my search in Indonesia. Last but not least, obviously, about tax incentives to invest, to trade, etc. It's a difficult topic because you have to apply that instrument very carefully, and there's obviously a lot of political impact. But what I've seen in Europe and the trade between the US and Europe, these were one of the fundamentals actually to have a free flow of traffic and digital trade between those two powerhouses. So it works quite well, but obviously it's not an easy thing to do. I think that's what I wanted to say about this. I'm conscious of time. Let me move to the next and my last slide. So you obviously have a great digital trade sector, right? Or community, which a massive momentum. It's one of the fastest growing digital trade territories in the world. And there's a massive growth in internet adoption, right? So we have a super momentum, right? There's a super momentum in Indonesia. And it's crucial to keep it going, right? Because it will help not only digital trade, but it also will bring down the general costs of trade, right? Which stimulates the economy. So the question is, how would it be possible to accelerate this? And at minimum, can you sustain the growth rate? Well, with these figures, it's a super challenge, of course, right? Because this is a tremendous momentum, but it's something I think which is incredibly important for Indonesia. So what could you look at, right? You could look at digital, to look at the infrastructure and transformation of the current ways of working, right? So how can you influence that as a government, or what can you do? Well, first of all, keep developing a digital infrastructure, right? It's not a secret. Bandwidth is not abundant, right, in Indonesia, so it needs to be improved. Particularly, I think during pandemic, we experienced very often dips in connectivity, but also data storage, data farms. All that needs to be developed. Need to be policies around that you can store data easier outside the country. Obviously, within the risk frameworks, right? Because some industries is logic that you prevent it. What can you do as a government to stimulate certain technologies? Well, there are big investments in the government whatsoever. So government could actively consider to pilot with technologies to achieve some of their objectives, right? There are some very interesting examples in other parts of the world, which I didn't have time to discuss, but there you will see that the government is not developing technology, but they force an adoption of technology, which is always, of course, a tricky thing to do. But through state-owned enterprises and public sector services, this is a very common way of changing ways of working. Last but not least, look at the digital skills of the workforce, as discussed before, right? Very important point to keep growing the sector. Second point is keep working on the policies. I don't think that the policies for digital trade are in a majority different than optimizing trade in general, but obviously there's like 30% which is specifically focused on stimulating digital trade. So I think that's an very important factor to facilitate the growth rate, right, of digital trade in Indonesia. So Last point is look at partnerships between countries, between government and private sector, between universities in Indonesia and private sector and universities and governments outside Indonesia to suck in the knowledge that you need and the capabilities to grow this sector, right? It's impossible to keep this, to grow everything domestically. There's no country in the world that do that, right? The top digital industries, they attract globally. And the really high digital ones, really specific, it's more hardcore technology, they have no choice. They have no choice than to have the globe as their hunting ground for talent. So that's very important to open up. So coming to the end of my presentation, given time, I'm a bit over time, my apologies, but I shared three things, right? One is the digital trade sector in Indonesia is important and will become more important. Second point was, okay, keep looking at other countries to look at their success factors and try to learn from it. And the third point is there are three areas I think where which are needed to work on to keep the sector blooming and growing as it was in the last couple of years, which is ways of working and digital infrastructure, policies, and collaboration across the board with between governments, private sector, countries, and individual institutions. With that, I would like to end. Thank you for your time, and I wish you a very fruitful day in the breakout session and discussing the results of the research. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Van de Mheen, for the presentation. It was very interesting to see how right policies and strategies have considerable potential to increase Indonesia's competitiveness and to boost Indonesia's trade in the future. And I'm sure with the speech from Bapak Kasan and also the presentation from Mr. Van de Mheen make all of us want to start to jump into the panel discussion. But before that, we will have a virtual photo session first. That's why we would like to invite Bapak Kasan and also Mr. Van de Mheen to take picture together with all of us and all the audience. Oke, Bapak Ibu, kami mengundang Bapak Ibu untuk dapat berfoto bersama. Untuk itu tentunya kami mohon kepada Bapak dan Ibu untuk dapat menyalakan kamera dan memberikan senyum terbaiknya pada pagi hari ini. Untuk itu kepada panitia kami persilahkan. Saya mungkin hitung 2 kali ya. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Sekali lagi terima kasih and thank you so much Mr. Van de Mheen for your time. Really appreciate it and it's such an honor to have you here, Pak. Dan terima kasih Bapak Kasan, terima kasih merupakan suatu kehormatan bagi kami Bapak dapat meluangkan waktu dan membuka acara kita pada pagi hari ini. Baiklah Bapak dan Ibu dimanapun berada, seluruh peserta diseminasi hasil analisis Badan Pengkajian dan Pengembangan Perdagangan tahun 2021, acara selanjutnya adalah sesi panel. Dan untuk itu, panitia akan segera membagi Bapak dan Ibu ke dalam ruangan-ruangan Zoom yang telah Bapak Ibu pilih ketika melakukan pendaftaran. Dan untuk itu kami mohon Bapak dan Ibu untuk tidak meninggalkan layar komputer atau handphone Anda, karena panitia akan segera melakukan proses breakout room. Dan sebagai informasi, pada sesi berikutnya, acara akan terbagi ke dalam 3 ruangan, yaitu ruang perdagangan dalam negeri, ruang perdagangan luar negeri, dan ruang kerjasama perdagangan internasional. Dan bagi Bapak dan Ibu yang telah memilih ruang perdagangan dalam negeri, maka Bapak dan Ibu akan tetap berada di ruangan utama, sedangkan untuk Bapak dan Ibu yang memilih untuk sesi ruang perdagangan luar negeri dan ruang kerjasama perdagangan internasional, maka Bapak dan Ibu akan segera menerima notifikasi dari panitia untuk segera dipindahkan ke ruangan sesuai yang telah Bapak Ibu pilih sebelumnya. Baik, Bapak Ibu, demikian acara pembukaan dan sesi utama Diseminasi Hasil Analisis Badan Pengkajian dan Pengembangan Perdagangan tahun 2021. Selanjutnya, acara di masing-masing ruangan akan dipandu oleh moderator. Untuk itu, kepada para penanggung jawab dan moderator, waktu dan tempat kami persilahkan. Saya, Dini Ramadhani, pamit undur diri. Mohon maaf atas segala kesalahan serta kekurangan, dan selamat mengikuti sesi berikutnya dalam Diseminasi Hasil Analisis Badan Pengkajian dan Pengembangan Perdagangan tahun 2021. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.